Thank you very much. And so this paper arises from the research I've been doing on the Diseases of Modern Life project, which is 19th century perspectives, but very much with a sense of how the awareness of pressure, 24/7 life, too much information, etc., that we suffer from now, have their origins in the 19th century, and, as Clark showed us earlier, in the 18th century as well. Given current situations, I thought it would be quite good to start off with a sleepless Prime Minister. In December 1882, William Gladstone, who was PM at the time, started to have trouble sleeping, and by early January he was concerned. So he'd gone up to his country estate in Hawarden when Parliament broke up in mid-December. And so January the 2nd, he starts recording his worries. Last night my sleep was further cut down to 3 to 4 hours. Hardly enough oil for my lamp, I fear. January the 3rd, sleep improved from 3.5 to 4.5 hours. Too little for me, though it has served for greater and better men. Next day, a much more successful night, up to 6 hours. Then the next night, only 5.5. And then he telegraphs for his physician to rush up to Wales to come and see to him. The physician, Andrew Clark, arrives and he stops what was clearly the main worry for Gladstone, which was having to go up to his constituency, where he hadn't been for 3 years, and prescribed as much rest as possible. And he says, last night, almost strangely, out of 11 hours in bed, I slept full 9. And he then records, can you see this? Possibly not. Oh dear. So this is just a page of his diary. And so it starts off who he wrote to, the Queen, Lord Granville, etc. And then you've got a summary of clearly his consultation with Andrew Clark. Can anybody read it? Because it looks very blurred. Oh, good. It's the angle from here. It looks very blurred. So the problem was his practice of regulating action by brain. And then, very interestingly, single sign of brain resentment heretofore. Now, I've never come across this phrase in other medical texts, brain resentment, but I think it's rather wonderful. Then you can see he hadn't had much problems before, but now he's noticing it. Then, number 7, his doesn't seem much effect on his health, except the brain, which is slightly confused. But interestingly, no sleepiness in the daytime or evening. But to suggest now that he's going to move on to a period of getting extensive rest. Andrew Clark had advised that he needed complete abstinence from work and a change of place. His sleep now improves. On the 12th, he says, a great night and oversleep, 9 hours. And then on the 15th, he starts for the south of France. He says, we shall see what change of air, with God's blessing, may effect. And he arrives on the 18th, and he writes on the 19th, I'm stunned by this wonderful place, and so vast a change at a moment's notice in the conditions of life. So I'm looking at a lot of invalids who are ordered to go to the south of France. Very, very difficult penance. They normally have this amazed reaction, can life really be like this? Certainly for Gladstone, he thought it was amazing. He writes to Clark on the 20th, he's sleeping well and feeling invigorated. What I'm inclined to feel is a desire to do full justice to this experiment, note it's very scientised, by prolonging my stay as much as I may. Press were very interested. Good to see. This is the front page of the graphic. This is the Chateau Scott where he stayed, and there they are, relaxing on the terrace. Here they are, taking their drives as you had to. And he, at this time, Parliament was out of session, but he was doing some work, but then Parliament returns to session, and Gladstone is still in camp. I think it's wonderful. So he doesn't return until 2 weeks after Parliament has started. And one of the explanations for his behaviour he gives to the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, through my long political life, sleep has been to me a mainstay, and the failure of it for the first time between November and January last led me to take what is a rather violent measure for one holding my office, and to place myself here for some weeks. The air of the place, an exemption from business, carried as far as it could be, has done me great good. Now, I've given Gladstone's case in some detail as it gives an insight into the concerns and anxieties at the time around sleeplessness. His sleeplessness clearly, by some standards, was not very severe at all, but yet he was given 6 weeks in the south of France. And this is all very much linked to the emerging discourses of overwork at the time, and the sense that you could lose vital powers. And it became perfectly respectable for people in business, in professions, to actually take these very extended holidays. And so you've got this seeming paradox that the Victorians, who were absolutely dedicated to what they called the gospel of work, yet increasingly from the 1860s, it became acceptable and even expected that professional men would take extended time off work to recoup their vital energies. And sleep, or rather lack of it, was one of the prime indicators of this problem. Now, critic Anton Rabinach has talked in The Human Motor about the discourse of energy dynamics that developed in the 19th century, but he's done very little on the treatment of sleep. And sleep, as we've heard through this morning, has always attracted attention and concern. And in the mid-19th century, these concerns were linked to further ones about the changing forms and pace of life under industrialism, but also with the rise of physiological psychology and increasingly materialist understandings of the mind and body, and also the development of experimental measurement. Now, the English physician Henry Holland, who wrote in Sleep in the 1840s and 50s, remarked that it was surprising how little we knew about sleep, notwithstanding the perpetual experiment which life affords upon the subject. A rather intriguing formulation. But this was to shift in the 1860s. First of all, you had in England a surgeon who was at Guy's, Arthur Durham, who started trepanning dogs, cutting off tops of scalps and putting glass over them and then studying the brain. And then in America, there was an army surgeon, William Hammond, who happened on someone who'd had a railway accident and got a cranial fissure, so you could actually see the behaviour of the brain during sleep. And he, as well as Durham, started experimenting massively on dogs and rabbits and using also all sorts of sleeping effects of ether, chloroform, etc., to see their impact. Now, interestingly, these experiments had huge sort of cultural impact. So in the 1866, for example, there were articles on sleeplessness in the Spectator and the Cornhill, talking about the experiments and what they'd shown about how the flow of blood, which it was thought previously had increased in sleep, but now they'd shown decreased in sleep. And they're using this to support the emerging arguments that it is professional men who are most prey to sleeplessness. So the physicians, the lawyers, the speculators, because they are the ones who are doing brain work. And this is the time, brain work as a term had been around, but suddenly it becomes all important because what they're doing is showing that brain work is just as much work as physically, manually labouring. So the Spectator says, sleeplessness, we suspect, is one of the most frequent and most annoying concomitants of civilised life. And it concludes, any system which really increased the average capacity for sleep would benefit nervous disease, increase the habitableness of great cities, and probably diminish perceptibly the average of lunacy. So it speaks very well to our papers this morning. Both offer various remedies, including getting rid of the nasty Western contrivance of the feather pillow, but they have particular focus on the hour of dining, suggesting that you should eat before sleeping. And you've got the rise of a huge slew of advice literature and remedies for sleeplessness at this time. And particularly it's the emergence of beef tea and bovril and all these things that are marketed as night food to stop you going hungry during the night. Now, histories of sleep research often start in the 1950s or the 1920s, and this ignores the 19th century precedents and, of course, the 18th and right through backwards. And I was thinking, is there evidence that people have watched sleep prior to this? And I realised that Esquirel who was a psychiatrist in France in the early 19th century, he actually argued that in order to understand people's mental conditions, you had to watch them whilst they slept. And in the child study movement in the 1890s, parents were told that if they were dedicated to their children, they would watch them and observe them whilst they were asleep. But the person I want to turn to now is Angelo Mosso, a physiologist in Turin, who he invented the human balance, which was, he had someone laid out as if on a table, and he measured the flow of blood and so measured the flow of emotion. So he believed, and it's been hailed as the forerunner of the MRI scanner. But he also invented the ergograph to measure fatigue, and he also studied subjects with holes in their brains. And there's wonderful accounts he has of his interaction with these various patients. But I want to focus on his interactions with Bertino, who was a mountaineer who'd been hit by a brick and left with this hole right in his forehead. And what Mosso did also was created what he called self-recording instruments, and so that he could actually attach one of these recording devices to the brain. And as he says, let us now see how the brain writes when it guides the pen itself. So I think this is the first time that the brain was seen to record itself. Right, so this is an account of their first experiment with Bertino. It says, at length, Bertino fell asleep. Consciousness was extinguished. The troublous thoughts of life had ceased. Only the last sentinels of the nervous system were still vigilant. At the slightest noise, a wave of blood disturbed the surface of the brain. If the hospital clock struck the hour, or someone walked along the terrace, if I moved my chair, or wound up my watch, or if a patient coughed in the next room, everything, the slightest sound, was accompanied by a marked alteration in the circulation of the brain, all immediately traced by the pen, which the brain guided on the paper of my registering apparatus. And there's, in another passage, there's wonderful, when they first try these instruments, that they are virtually hugging each other, but they can't make any sound because they know they're going to disturb the other patients in the ward. But a sense of wonder, I think, that the slightest things are actually disturbing the sleep of this subject. Mosso wrote two wonderful books, one on fear and one on fatigue, that, as you can see from this writing style, were actually for the general public. And what he did was confirm the views of the time, that it was the middle classes, and particularly professional men, who suffer from excess of brain work and hence sleeplessness, who suffer from insomnia. And the last section of his book on fatigue, I realise I haven't given you some of the other illustrations. So that's another recording of the various brain waves there. Yes, so the end of fatigue, he talks about intellectual fatigue and the problems for students of the overpressure in examinations and education, and problems for politicians. He said political men, with few exceptions, wear themselves out by overwork and age very rapidly, and insomnia and headaches being the first symptoms. And he says that sleep is of little use to them, for they dream of debates and political affairs. And he says, if this happens to you, you have no need to consult a doctor. We must take a holiday, or greater evils will follow. So it all helps to explain Gladstone. So at this point, there was an outpouring then of medical and popular accounts of the dangers of sleeplessness. And what I'm particularly interested in is the idea that you can die of overwork. I've gone through the OD&B, and in the 19th century, there's 445 cases of men who were reputed to have died of overwork. And I'm fascinated by this because you don't now say that people die of overwork, even though the entries still claim that they had died of overwork. So a question, and I started to realise that this is probably all linked to sleep, and that's really maybe what's at the base of it. So the medical writers were emphasising the problems of fellow medics as well in all this. So Ralph, in a work on overwork and premature mental decay of 1876, gives the case of Dr. Gert Byrd, who was a London physician who died, it is said, of overwork at the age of 40. And his advice to Ralph before he died was, never mind at what loss, take your 6 weeks holiday. Otherwise, you will find yourself, at my age, a prosperous practitioner, but a dying old man. And he has an absolutely wonderful obituary in the Association Medical Journal, which is the forerunner of the British Medical Journal. So it talks about his devotion to his work and to Guy's Hospital. But how great the price, the daily anxiety, the sacrifice of health, the premature grave. He saw but the laurels in the distance and recked not the cypress that was springing up in his path. It's wonderful we don't write obituaries like that, do we, anymore? And even when his days were numbered, he heroically hastened the last edition of his work on urinary deposits through the press. So I think that's an absolute lesson for us all, the importance of our tomes on urinary deposits. We also have an earlier case of a Cambridge classicist who died of overwork, and it's reported in the Lancet. It's headed Overwork, the sad death of the Reverend Arthur Holmes, who Dean and Senior Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, by his own hand last Saturday, adds another name to the list of those who've fallen victim to the failure of an overworked brain. And talks about how brilliant he was, and then at this particular time he had too many scripts to examine. So again, a lesson for us all. But he'd been suffering from sleepless nights, and he'd resorted to chloral, which I'll talk about in a bit, because it became very important at the time. I turn now to Benjamin Ward Richardson, author of Diseases of Modern Life and progenitor of our project, in 1876. Sleeplessness is throughout this work, but there's a special category, diseases from late hours and broken sleep. And he attacks the young who believe they can get away with reducing sleep, saying time was made for slaves, which apparently was a coinage at that time, but obviously with dire results for them. And he talks about a fellow practitioner who never took a holiday. But he also talks about the modern habits of late hours, those unearthly balls and evening parties where the young of both sexes are called together to dance into utter prostration of mind and body until the daylight dawns and the sun rises to expose the tawdriness of the ballroom and the helplessness of the half-dreaming, sleepless, pale, shivering revellers. So again, picking up from the 18th century, this turning night into day and the upside downness of the rhythms. So this becomes a standard trope, as does the over-anxious student and also the chloral sufferer. Now, in 1879, Richardson wrote a paper, Chloral and Other Narcotics. He worked on anaesthetics, and he had been asked, when chloral came to England in 1868, to test it for the British Association of Advancement of Science. And he warned about the dangers but was ignored. And now he says there's a new disease, which he christened chloralism, which is mostly men of the middle classes, commercial, literary, legal, medical, philosophical, artistic and clerical. And there are lots of popular and medical writings from this time on the dangers of sleeping draughts, which produce sleep, which they say is not sleep. The most famous case was John Tyndall, the famous scientist. In the Lancet on March 20th of 1886, they announced, Sir William Gull informs us that Professor Tyndall has for a long time suffered from sleeplessness, which at length, with hard scientific work, has much prostrated the nervous system. It is to be hoped that he will now take a long rest, which is so much needed for his restoration. And Tyndall, in fact, unfortunately, was to die in 1893 by an accidental overdose of chloral administered by his wife. I'm going to just give you some ads. Here we are, brain salt. They're all, you probably can't read it all. This is famous people who died from overwork. This is a wonderful thing that will give you sleep, of course, didn't. Then this is Harvard. So this was trying to solve my question of can you die of overwork? And this was Harvard to say that yes, you can, and that you can lead to even early mortality, which I think is what was being suggested this morning as well. And so I think I will end, though, with Benjamin Ward Richardson. Where he says, sleep reduces fever, quickens nutrition, increases elimination, soothes pain and encourages the healing of wounded surfaces. Whoever is first to discover the still secret cause of natural sleep and the mode in which it may be commanded by art for the service of mankind will be the greatest healer who has, up to this age, helped to make medicine immortal. So here's a challenge for our scientific colleagues. So I'll finish on that.